we've got a minute to go, so we're going to go live on the webcast. We don't actually have anybody watching us at the moment, but
This is me. I'm watching. Press that, and then when you're finished.
Right, I'd like to open the meeting. Welcome to the first meeting of the Corporate Scrutiny Panel for the new year. And I'd like to thank everybody who's attended. This meeting is being webcast, so it is available for people to see. So if we can just bear that in mind during the meeting. This is a scrutiny panel, so it's not political, so we leave our politics outside of the door, and our role here is to scrutinise the administration. So I hope everybody will stick with that today. If anybody does wish to speak, you have a microphone in front of you, and when I ask you to come in, if you can press the red button in the middle to make your mic live so that you can be heard, and also that the webcast will be able to pick you up. I'll start by just going through the membership of the committee, and I'll start with myself, and then I can ask members to just briefly come in and introduce themselves. So my name is Councillor John Taylor, and I represent the Kirkburton ward. I'll start with the front.
Hi there, my name is Christina Parks and I'm a voluntary co-optee.
Hi, James Ryan, co-optee.
Gary Kitchen, also a co-optee.
Councillor John Lawson, Cleckheaton.
Councillor Harry McCarthy for Corn Valley Ward.
Tyler Hawkins, Dalton Ward Councillor.
I can ask the officers and cabinet member to just briefly introduce themselves.
Councillor Paul Davies.
Hi, I'm Rachel Spencer-Henschel, the Strategic Director for Corporate Strategy, Commissioning and Public Health here at the Council.
Hi, my name's Eamon Croston, Service Director, Finance for the Council.
And hi, Sarah Brown, Head of Service Welfare and Exchequer.
Thank you. If I can just check, have we had any apologies? The next item on the agenda, item 2, is the minutes of the previous meeting. Now, ordinarily, I would ask 2 members of the committee to confirm the minutes. We don't actually have anybody present who was actually at the last meeting. So I think all we can do today is just note the minutes. We'll just formally note them in the agenda and move on, if we may. Item 3 on the agenda is interests. And I would ask if members of the committee have any interests to declare. Yeah. If during the meeting you do find that you do have an interest to declare, there is a form in the agenda to complete, and if you can hand that to Jenny at the end of the meeting, please. May. Thank you. And if I just check, have we had any deputations or petitions?
None received.
Thank you. Yes?
One of the local food banks.
Thank you. If you can just hand the form in at the end, John. Thank you. Item 6, public questions. Do you have anybody wishing to ask a question?
No.
Just for new members of the committee, members of the public are able to attend these sessions and ask questions in the meeting, but we haven't had any today.
Thank you so much, Chair. So as John said, it's just an opportunity for me to share the kind of directorate responsibilities and also that of the portfolio holder, just so that helps your work plan discussion in the informal session later. I'm conscious that a number of you may have been able to access the training that was put on for scrutiny. So if some of this is slightly duplicating that, then I apologise. I'll just make sure I can get the IT to work. I can. So just a slide there stating out what the remit of the Corporate Scrutiny Panel is. So it's in relation to cabinet decisions and service provision, in particular those with the relevant portfolio holder, which is obviously Councillor Davies. It's any matter relating to corporate services, and obviously a lot of authorities determine corporate services in different ways. So what this hopefully captures today is kind of how this council looks at corporate services, but there is a specific provision that finance and other support services and activities are included in that. So the sorts of things you would expect to see are things like HR and people and finance, but obviously there are other bits that represent the portfolio that myself and obviously Councillor Davies has. So, Councillor Davies as the portfolio holder covers the following areas. Now, if you have read the council plan, there are a number of priorities assigned to this portfolio that sit within there, and this is how his portfolio is split out. Now, as is always the case with a complex system like the council, some of these sit within another strategic director's area, but it's just how the leader has determined his cabinet responsibilities. So this is what Councillor Davies is responsible for, and I will just take you through. So this is my directorate and what I've got in terms of my responsibility. So I have responsibility for governance, commissioning and procurement, which sits under Julie Muscroft, who's also the council's monitoring officer. And they're the functions that sit under her responsibility. I'm also responsible for Eamon in the sense of the services he managed, but obviously he's the statutory 151, so it's a slightly complex makeup, but again, it seems to work for us, which is good. And that includes things like welfare and exchequer services and how we support the public through finance, and also things like looking at commercialisation opportunities. And then we've got the other support services under Andy Simcox, which is intelligence and performance, making sure that we can understand the performance of the organisation, looking at and developing policy, how we work with our strategic partners, communications and the communication strategy, IT, and then how we look at transformation, so how we think about the services that need to be done very differently. And then finally, we've got people services, which would include HR in terms of the more transactional services, things like how we pay our staff, payroll, etc., but also organisational development and things like employee healthcare, so how we obviously support our staff in terms of making sure that they are, their well-being is looked after. So, Councillor Davies' responsibilities also, there are bits that sit with other strategic directors in the organisation. So, David Shepherd looks after the kind of asset base, so council's assets, and obviously I mean physical assets when I say that. So that's part of Councillor Davies' portfolio and maybe something that you want to look at in the work plan when you discuss it this afternoon. And then obviously access to services and libraries, that sits within Richard Parry's directorate, who looks after adults and health, but certainly things like customer service centres and how people can access the council is a corporate function, but obviously Richard looks at that because it helps to sit nicely with how we support residents in terms of adult social care and other people-based needs. So I hope that's clear as much as it can be, and I will happily share the presentation afterwards so that you can get a sense of that, but hopefully it will give you an idea of how you want to make your work programme look this afternoon. So I think you'll have all sort of seen this in terms of the programme. So for developing your work plan this afternoon, it's very much what we've looked at in previous years, and you know, having a conversation about what you would want to look at over the next 12 months, particularly in light of any key decisions that are coming up from this portfolio's perspective, and obviously anything else that would be of interest. I've had a long conversation with Councillor Taylor about how we look at this going forward, and based on his steer, I've pulled together a sort of starter for 10 for the discussion this afternoon, along with obviously what Councillor Davies is looking at in his priorities. So hopefully we'll get a plan that will suit everybody's purpose. Things like corporate performance and impact reports that usually go to the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee are useful because what they may do is give you areas of performance that you want to have a deep dive on within the scrutiny panel and look at areas where you'd want to have a further conversation. So there's a level of flexibility within the plan. Obviously, we want to try and make sure officers have enough time to prep for it, and obviously portfolio holder as well, but clearly we want to also make it a really useful discussion. And then just finally, there's a number of committees in this organisation, and it sometimes is challenging to try and work out how they all connect together. But this slide tries to articulate the distinction between what a corporate scrutiny panel would do and what the corporate governance and audit committee would do. So clearly, council's role in terms of scrutiny is review of policy and its formulation and implementation, whereas corporate governance and audit is an assurance role in relation to the council being effective and financial management is fit for purpose. So I think the area that Councillor Taylor and I were kind of exploring was risk management and how you would look at the role of both corporate governance and audit, which obviously looks at risk, as well as corporate scrutiny. And I think that will be something to debate this afternoon to suit what you as corporate scrutiny members would want to see. Is that okay then, Chair?
Thank you, Rachel. I'll bring members in first, and I'll probably make a couple of comments at the end. But any questions, observations, or anything anybody wanted to ask? Thanks, John.
Just briefly, Chair. Thanks, Rachel. That's very clear, and I think those kinds of things are always a really good refresher, really good reminder of just where things lie in council. So thanks for that. The last slide, though, when we talk about risk, we have had in the past, when I was last on this, a year before last, we had the risk register as a standing item on this panel. I thought that was useful, even if it's not the full risk register, but the first 10 items or something like that, and where there's been travel. Maybe this is for a discussion for the next meeting. But yes, there is a definite overlap in between the two panels there. So it'd be just interesting to see how we knit those together. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So for me, thank you, Rachel. I have the joy of sitting on corporate governance and audit as well as corporate scrutiny, and I struggle with this. And I think it's not helped that I attend both meetings, so sometimes it does get a little complicated. So I think that in itself was very, very useful. I think what the scope of this panel that Rachel's just outlined shows that there are some areas that are going to be critically important, not just to the council, but to our communities this year, that fall within the remit of the panel. And I'm sure we'll get into that in some more detail when we do the workshop planning session a little later on. But I think it's useful to have that in mind in advance and, have Rachel's thoughts before we move into that informal session later on. So I'd like to thank Rachel for that agenda item. And if you need to escape, you can escape now. And we'll see you perhaps later on. And if the panel's happy, I'll move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item number 8. And I'm going to ask Eamon if he wouldn't mind introducing that.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, this is a financial update, and did speak to the Chair beforehand about how we would pitch this, given what's going on nationally, internationally, and there's so much, I think, to articulate on so many fronts. But what we wanted to do with this particular update is keep it fairly succinct and high level. I'm really glad that we've got some fresh faces as well on corporate scrutiny panel as well to add different perspectives. I'll get me pitch out the way that we do bring financial management update reports into the corporate scrutiny panel through the year, and we'll pick that up as part of the planning conversation as well later, so what might be appropriate. But I am mindful with so many new faces as well. I think it would be useful to do a bit of a refresher on how council finance works and how it, because then that I think that will help yourselves as well and help us in terms of your observations. So we'll set something up around that if you're keen and willing to participate, and I'm sure you will be. It's not as esoteric as you might think. In many respects, it's quite straightforward, but As we alluded to earlier, it operates in quite a high-risk environment as well on so many fronts. So the high-level report that's presented this morning, so tried to chunk it up into three broad parts. So the first part, while fairly brief, just gives some of the important international and national context factors in terms of economic, societal impacts, obviously the cost of living crisis that has been felt globally, nationally, regionally and locally. We'd only just put our budget plans to bed at Budget Council in February the 16th, and 8 days later, all hell lets loose in Central Eastern Europe. So, and that's really changed the context, I think, for a lot of the issues that are arising now. So, you'll obviously be all aware of what's playing out nationally and internationally, and some of the key headlines and some of the many and varied challenges that governments globally are wrestling with. So what we thought would be useful as well to put into context, obviously an acknowledgement that the cost of living impacts are featuring heavily with our residents, with businesses, communities, but just to set out some of the measures that this council and other councils are putting in place locally, some key measures, some of which we're able to support through our own earmark budgets in terms of sort of priorities, priority budgets targeted at helping our most vulnerable, but clearly this is capturing a much wider net in terms of impacts of cost of living and businesses as well. But there are quite a significant number of measures, support measures that we've set out in here. It doesn't capture everything, but it does capture quite a few of those measures, and obviously recognition of what's happening in terms of government support as well. There's been two key announcements this year so far, and we've also attempted to translate through Sarah and colleagues, Welfare and Exchequer in particular, what does that potentially mean for residents as well in terms of some of those national measures to support some of the household pressures. So we've also then set out, again in quite high level terms, particularly what the inflationary impacts, economic impacts are having on our assumptions, or likely to have on our assumptions as a council, in terms of what we previously set aside to support things like salary uplifts over our medium-term financial plans, fuel inflationary pressures above and beyond what we perhaps budgeted for. Clearly energy costs, which are impacting everywhere. That's having potentially a significant impact as well in terms of what council challenges might be. There's a whole range of potential service demand impacts as well to consider in all of this as well, and potentially increasing demands on organisations like councils and partner agencies and other support agencies, given the increased cohort of households that are affected, and emerging pressures on businesses as well from potential economic impacts. So all of those are in the mix, and we know as well that the Bank of England is incrementally increasing interest rates as well, quite rapidly, as are the other federal banks, key federal banks across the globe. So what consequential impact might that have in terms of our future borrowing, current and future borrowing cost assumptions, given that we've got a very ambitious regeneration agenda within our multi-year capital plans, a substantial portion of which is currently funded by borrowing, but there's also a significant number of other funding as well that's coming in from central government and through the region, through West Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. I'm going back about 40 odd years. Mayoral Combined Authority, and those funding pots are also under pressure because of the inflationary impact on global supply chains, materials, etc. So that was just to give you a bit of a flavour. So by all means, chip in with whatever discussion points you want to raise in context of that. There's also a brief reference, going back to the corporate risk register. Even the plans that we'd signed off in February, we knew that there were a number of pre-existing budget risks attached with those plans anyway. And what was also highlighted in February, that there were a number of national policy developments as well that we would have to take into account as a council, be it around environment, be it around waste strategy, social care reforms featuring quite heavily as well, health and social care integration. And while government has set aside funds nationally to support some of those initiatives, as with all these things, the devil's in the detail, and those implications, particularly but not exclusively around social care reforms, around the funding care caps, etc. All authorities with statutory responsibility for social services are currently modelling through the impact of that to assess whether the quantum of funding that's been set aside by government nationally is going to be enough to support that, or even if it is, what the potential distribution of that might be. So that's just kind of a marker at this stage, just to reflect there are some big ticket pre-existing sort of budget risk issues that were already in the plans. And obviously what's happened on the 24th of February has probably added significantly in terms of the sensitivity analysis and stress testing around the council's financial plans, but also around the potential demands on the organisation. I'll just leave you at this point in terms, otherwise I'll just hog the whole session, so I need to stop soon and the chair's staring at me. You'll have also probably picked up as well that there's emerging national commentary starting to come through from the sector. Local Government Association, for example, are obviously, you know, as they would, highlighting some of the key financial challenges from the inflationary impacts and just kind of in general terms setting out what that broad range of impacts might mean in terms of additional financial challenges for the sector. You might have seen figures quoted in excess of 2 billion in terms of current year pressures, and at this moment in time, accepting that national government's facing a whole plethora of concurrent, you know, different issues that they have to resolve. We don't know yet what additional funding there might be to support council pressures, both in the short term and over the next and future financial years as well. It's difficult to second guess at this stage, other than we can just highlight as part of a sectoral response some of the obvious pressures above and beyond what we would have budgeted for in February, and they're quite significant. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Eamon. I'll not come in with comments first. I'd like to hear from the panel first. So comments and questions from anybody who would like to come in. Tyler?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Eamon. Really informative. Appreciate the update on that. Just, I mean, I know it's hard to forecast so far. We're in July, and then we're going to be coming up to budget in February, aren't we? So it's quite a way off. But based on, if everything remains, I say equal, but what we're anticipating in the future, do you think at the moment it looks like we'll be running at a budget deficit, or are we going to have sort of problems in the future that we really need to be thinking about sort of right now? Thank you, Chair.
Good question to start with. Yes, thank you. But, you know, it's a very pertinent question, isn't it? I mean, what I will say is that there isn't a council nationally that isn't wrestling with this. And, you know, to varying degrees, some councils, a lot like us, we've got statutory responsibilities for children and adults. Councils might have different size capital plans, ambitions, you know, different levels of future borrowing ambition. So there is undoubtedly going to be significant pressure on the bottom line above and beyond. We're working through a range of options at the sensitivities to assess what they might be. So they are many and varied, but we do know, for example, that there's current discussions going on about what the salary uplift might be for local government staff as part of the national pay discussions for 22-23, and whether or not there might be a 2-year settlement for pay. There's discussions about what the national living wage uplift might be for next year, which might be significantly higher than we'd even predicted for, which will have implications on our pay scale, but it would also have implications for some of our key third-party providers as well, particularly but not exclusively care sector. A lot of our provision is done through third parties, and they're obviously struggling and wrestling with the same issues as well around, you know, a decent living wage for their staff, for care staff, and that's going to be critical. So we would potentially have to passport on any national living wage uplifts to ensure that they've got sufficient resources to continue to deliver those services. So I can't give you a definitive figure at this stage, but it will be significant, and it will be a pressure on the council's bottom line. There will be some reports coming through as part of the normal reporting cycle, so we'll have a financial update report going to Cabinet on August the 9th, which will be like our quarter one monitoring position, but undoubtedly we're going to have to start putting some meat on the bones in terms of what it might mean in terms of in-year pressures. But the position is volatile. You can come to a snapshot in time and get to a bottom line, and then a week later the goalposts are shifting, but they're not necessarily shifting either way. So they're only going in one direction at the moment. I don't know if that answers it. That sounds like a politician's response, doesn't it? It's not meant to be. Okay, all right. Thank you for that question.
If I can bring Councillor Lawson in.
Thank you, Chair. Given what Emma's just said about the future and knitting fog in financial terms, I kind of expect a similar answer, sorry, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. And it's about future borrowing. We know that borrowing has impacts on our revenue when we come to servicing debt. We know that there's a tolerable figure, which is fairly subjective for that. Do we have an idea of what that figure is at the moment, how we're servicing debt, and at what point does that become uncomfortable? At what point does that become unsustainable? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor, for that question. Yeah, another very pertinent question. So when we set out our multi-year budget plans in February, we had in view at that point an initial assessment of all the capital ambition. That's in our plans. So we're looking at over a 6-year stretch, and it might even stretch beyond that. We're probably looking at round about, was it just over 900 million, plus some of which is housing revenue account, which provides services for social housing. But that's quite a significant sum in its own right, and I think round about 400 million of that, from memory, was intended to be funded by prudential borrowing, which is local government borrowing. You're absolutely right, that borrowing has to be affordable. So we'd set out our predictions at that point about what it would cost to service that debt over a long period of time. And that debt isn't immediate, it builds up, because that 900 million capital plan and the borrowing element of that is profiled investment over 5-6 year time frame. And we know as well that we get slippage for various reasons in schemes, so we do factor in an element of slippage. You could almost view that 5-6 year plan as a stretched 7-8 year plan, almost, is probably a way of looking at it. So we did build in some predicted debt servicing costs, for example, for the Cultural Heart programme, which is in there at 210 million. Again, off the top of my head, that came to around about, I think, 6.8 million. But again, that would build up over time. And then we added in the predicted costs for future borrowing for the other schemes as well, which came to about 4 or 5 million. So we factored that in. So that's an additional ask on the overall council bottom line over the medium term. So we've had that in view, but it was obviously based on a set of estimates at a point in time around likely interest rate costs. So we're going to have to recalibrate that, because interest rates have gone up within quite a short space of time. Historically, they're still relatively low compared to what they were a decade or so ago. But given the last few years, we've been used to having really low interest rates, not just for long-term borrowing, but also for short-term borrowing, which supports our daily cash flow and treasury management needs. So it's not just about the long term, it's about the day-to-day working capital requirements for the council as well. So again, we're putting some sensitivity analysis in that. I don't think any of us in this room can predict what is going to happen over the next few years in terms of, I suppose, macroeconomic and fiscal policy in this country, but we're also impacted on by what's happening globally as well. And so that's obviously going to be a factor. So interest rates could be volatile for a period in time, and then at some point in the future, they might come down. At some point in the future, inflation pressures might come down, but it's difficult to predict at what point in the future. When we were coming out of the pandemic, all the indications were that we were starting to recover. So there was it was felt that there was some short-term continuing inflationary impacts because of global supply shortages and labour supply issues, but that they would settle down. I think what's happened in Central Europe, it's completely changed the geopolitical landscape, as we know, but also the macroeconomic landscape. And it's likely that some of those pressures are going to be more than transitory, but we don't know how much longer in the future. So probably what you're going to see over the coming months is a lot of sensitivity analysis rather than an absolute figure. And we've been doing that over the last few years, albeit in a summary form anyway, about, okay, this is our baseline assumptions about what we think our future spend is going to be and what we think our future funding is going to be. But if you tweak some of the main assumptions by small amounts, it could get appreciably worse, it could get appreciably better. So we're going to have to do this as well. But clearly, I think the borrowing costs are going to rise, so we have to reflect that. They may come down again at a point in time, and it may be that if we're still committed to the level of borrowing that we've got in our current plans, that if some of that investment is forward predicted to 3, 4, 5 years' time, you might second guess that actually interest rates might settle down a bit in that time. You might second guess that actually they might not settle down. So you have to be more prudent and factor in more prudent assumptions around your borrowing. In terms of whether or not those assumptions then bring into question the affordability, that has to be looked at in the context of the whole medium-term financial strategy and plan, not just in isolation, to have that broader discussion about what your priorities are, what the organisational priorities are, not just short-term but medium and longer term, accepting that some things are going to go up in cost from your previous predictions. And then on the back of that, how are you going to prioritise the rest of what the council does to accommodate that?
So just briefly.
Yeah.
Briefly, are we expecting any, on the horizon, are we expecting any significant offsetting from debt repayment or final repayment of debt?
A lot of this significant debt repayment that was based on historic high interest rates has actually been repaid. There are a few more repayments to come through, and we do because they're fixed, we know exactly when they're going to happen. So we do factor them into our treasury management budget prediction. So that's already been factored in. Yeah.
Right, Tyler, would you like to come in again?
Yep, sorry. Thank you, Chair, for a second bite of the cherry here. The question I'm going to ask is just to appreciate Eamon's thoughts on, but I know it's a question that all of us are going to be sort of part of trying to answer as well. It's in the council at the moment seems to be facing a personnel problem or trying to get the new people into the council, filling some of the roles where we've had long-standing vacancies. Just in your opinion and your view, where is there sort of a line between us being fiscally prudent in sort of what we allocate for paying of staff, yet also being competitive in a market with the private sector, which is offering more money as well? So as a council, how could be competitive in that market? As I say, I appreciate that's something for all of us to try and answer, I know. Thank you, Chair.
I'll just jump in because I think that's probably more a question for the cabinet holder than the officer as such. Yeah, you're right. We're facing a whole range of issues in terms of recruitment. It's UK-wide. There's an issue across all of the public sector, particularly and local government in particular, with what I would call early retirements. It's not early retirements, that sounds bad towards people. People deciding, particularly if you like in the aftermath of COVID, that they are now deciding to leave, you know, in the mid-50s and go. So that's hitting right across the sector, and absolutely will, I've no doubt, be an issue for us as well. So yeah, there is an issue out there in that regard. In terms of where we, as an administration and as a council, want to be in terms of employment, and you keep your, you know, we've heard this phrase many times, employer of choice, is absolutely to be looking at careers whereby somebody comes in and sees their development within the council, sees their support within the council, flexibility around the whole issue of workplace, etc. So all of those things which you have to put, you know, together in a package, along with obviously salaries and rates of remuneration. Those, I think, we're in a very good place, and those continue to be developed. There is the national pay negotiations will be commencing shortly, and obviously there will be a significant proposal being put forward. In terms of where we stand at the moment, I think Eamon can tell you the exact figure, but certainly there's a provision in the budget that we put forward within our plan budget. I think the fact is, I think it's very clear that that is an underestimate, and that's happened right across a whole range of other sectors. The private sector, some parts of the private sector now paying inflation level increases. We've seen, you know, I think everybody sees the national context in terms of industrial action around other sectors as well in terms of transport. I don't think it's a question that I can give a categoric answer to as to what we can afford. I think it's an issue of that discussion through the Employers Association with the trade unions, and trying to ensure that we, you know, as much as possible, that we put our employees in a position where they can work through the cost of living crisis that we've got now. And I go back to what I said earlier, it's not always, this sounds like a get-out clause, it's not always about the base rate. Clearly, that is extremely important. But as an employer, what else can we do to assist people in the pressures they face? And obviously, energy and transport, particularly petrol, diesel, etc., are massive issues. We've discussed that with the trade unions. I had a joint consultative meeting last week with them. And one of the key initiatives there has got to be a continuation, in fact, to even emphasise it even more about where our employees are located, you know, what their working patterns are, and what can we do as an employer to assist them in reducing those costs, because that's the big impact that people are feeling now. That does not preclude, obviously, any other discussions around salary increase. So that is a politician's answer, so instead of an officer's answer. But yeah, there's certainly there are very open discussions with the trade unions within our context. As I said, I chair the joint consultative group as well. So those discussions are ongoing. And it's, I think, going back to what Eamon said earlier on, it's very, very obvious we are going to face some very difficult sort of cost pressures, and everybody knows that. There's no point saying when simply energy, you can imagine for the LA, for local authority, is huge. We've got massive pressures in our schools. That's not really talked about that much in the media. The schools' budgets are being decimated because of energy costs, and that's going to have could have significant impact on their ability to deliver to the children in the future. So yeah, it's not an easy time. But one thing we will do, and we continue to do, as Eamon said, is to look at this both short-term, medium, and long-term, and we have to take that approach for the benefit of our citizens, because we have to look at a strategy whereby there isn't a knee-jerk reaction, that we don't try and just do short-term fixes, that we are looking at something that helps pull Kirklees out of what will probably be some form of recession coming forward. Sorry.
Thanks, Paul. Tyler, any further? If I can bring Councillor Lawson in again then, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the next one is our favourite. It's a three-part question, so I'll try and be brief. So it's talking about the £150 that government released to alleviate cost of living crisis earlier on in the year. And it's just some nuts and bolts questions. One is how much is still to be paid? The next question is how are we overcoming the digital divide, the digital hurdles for the people who are not on direct debit and don't have digital access? How are we trying to punch through that hurdle? And the cost of administration, just roughly how much are we expending on administrating these types of funds, and have we had any help from central government? And that's kind of, I'll stop there.
Who wants to pick that one up? Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. We're at the stage where we've paid 120,000 households. I'm afraid I don't have the exact figures to hand, but we've got about 40 plus left to target. We do have some plans afoot for that. And obviously it needs to be done and dusted by September if we're to achieve that. So we are confident that that's going to happen. In terms of the second part of the question, which was, sorry, three-parters.
So this was about the direct debits, the people who don't have direct debits, who are on the wrong side of the digital divide and struggling to get through to us in that
Yeah.
so engage with us.
Okay, so we do have a strategy for that. We are targeting folk by writing to them. We've got specific cohorts where we are we're taking it step by step. We have engagement via the telephone and also online and through our kind of corporate customer service centres to help direct people in the right direction. So we are trying, to kind of target those folk. We do have a backup plan because we are struggling time-wise. And for those where we really struggle to engage with them, we will be able to, at the end of the process, credit their council tax accounts, and we will be able to kind of dig in a little bit deeper at that stage if we identify there is a cohort that we really haven't managed to get hold of, to engage with them and try and get that money into their pockets. That is our kind of intent.
The last question, which was about the costs of administration.
Yes, certainly part of the monies from the central government was to help with the administration burden. I think the biggest hurdle for us has actually been the fact that we've needed more qualified staff from our current cohort of workers to help with that work. It's not been as easy as just bringing temps in. I think you've heard about the difficulties we've got with some of the areas around staff kind of pinched at several different areas within our service. We're managing it. The service has been through the kind of COVID pandemic where we were having to administer several different bits and pieces as time went on. So it's not something we're not used to, but certainly it's pinched us. And our priority as ever is to help everybody that needs helping, but also to bring the council coffers in terms of council tax and business rates. So it's a complicated process.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think I'm probably speaking for everyone here. If you could pass on our thanks to the team, because I know it's the same team that throughout the pandemic were doling out grant after grant after grant, and I don't think they've had a minute's pause, have they? So I think we're indebted to that team. I'd ask you to take that message back as well.
Thank you, that's very kind, Thank you.
Yep, thanks. I think something that's developed from this exercise, because it's a huge transactional exercise, and the pain has been felt right across the sector. And I think certainly government have learned from this as well, which is good, because I think there was an assumption that it would be relatively straightforward, and it's not. You know, we had to set up a completely new process, lots of assurance, which there should be anyway. So the good thing is, from this, the government certainly have picked up on this, so that the help that the government will now be providing to residents across the UK going forward, that they're doing that, you know, separately. It isn't through local authorities in that regard, which I think is welcome in that sense. So I think that's lessons learned, you know, from the government side, and obviously for us as well. There are some positives in the sense that from this exercise, we've now got a lot of intelligence on the ground in terms of people who perhaps before we wouldn't have known were vulnerable, who don't normally apply for support and benefits, and certainly in Welfare and Exchequer, that information would be really useful going forward in terms of the support, some of the support we can now provide through the local welfare provision. So I think all in all, you know, both from a governmental and from a local authority perspective, there's been some good learning and positive points. But I'd echo what Councillor Taylor said. I think that the team have been tremendous. They've worked, you know, extremely long hours, very short notice. And I can tell you from talking to them, there's a real passion and dedication to make sure that every single household that's entitled to this money will get the money. It will be, I think, you know, the case will be that some of them will get that as a rebate in the end directly, not as a cash, but as a credit rather than, not get the right words, but as a credit to their account. But it's been also interesting, and this is a comment I think which perhaps some people haven't picked up, the number of people who actually have said, well, I'm not entitled to this, but why should I be applying for this? And they are entitled to it. And I think that's another comment which is useful for us as well, because there is always this assumption that people are out there to try and grab things. Well, I don't think that's the experience people have in. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to bring Gary in.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question on trying to know the real situation out there, because I have a deep concern that there will be people slowly getting into a position, and with things like school holidays coming up, for example, that's always a really, really tough time for parents who are struggling. So what surveillance measures are being put in place to ensure that people in this kind of distress are being picked up before their circumstances become so much they're at risk of homelessness and that kind of thing, where you'd hope with some compassion there'd be ways of actually spotting people or getting people in that situation to come forward before it gets to that desperate state, and then get the help they need to avoid the worst circumstances. Thank you.
Do you want to pick that up, Paul?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So a number of things that's going on. There's what I've just referred to. We've now got a lot better connection with a whole range of people. Obviously the third sector, the voluntary sector, where we've developed really good partnerships, and in fact part of, I'll refer to this later on, one of my priorities in the portfolio is to increase investment in that sector, so to create that connection again with citizens. Encouraging the whole range of referrals and the partnerships we have, in particular with things such as food banks, etc. However, there is, I'm sure, a significant number of people who sit outside some of those areas. We're trying our best to get to them through a whole range of communications, and there's a cost of living campaign that our comms team are running, and you know, that's with social media, online, also providing information again through the third sector and through referrals and through things such as food banks, etc., with contacts, so that we can get people. And I'm sure Councillor Taylor will say the same. It's a frustration sometimes of us as councillors that we have a local welfare provision budget. It's not huge. We'll be discussing it at Cabinet today, and hopefully it should go through as 650,000. But it's to make people aware that that isn't a means-tested facility, and we've had that for a number of years to get people, again, to engage with us on that. I haven't got a simple answer for you, but absolutely, you know, we recognise that's something that we have to keep working on, working really hard. And councillors, I'm sure Councillor Taylor said this, councillors are a vital part of that in the communities in helping us to actually identify some of those groups.
Thanks, Judge. Before I bring you back in, Gary, two other things I'd probably mention as well. One is the work that the Community Plus and the social prescribing teams that sit alongside the primary healthcare team are very good sort of ears on the ground in terms of being out in the communities and hopefully picking up on some of those people that are vulnerable. But it is, and it always will be, one of the challenges. Some vulnerable people are the least likely to ask for support. And, you know, and I've come across cases in my own work as a counsellor, I'm sure my colleagues have as well, where you come across somebody who is in absolute need of support but doesn't think they're deserving of it. And sometimes you have the challenge to get them to actually accept help sometimes as well. But I'll bring you back in, Gary, if you want to.
Yeah, thank you. I realise it's a very difficult thing to answer. There's no easy way to do this. But for example, I know of one person who was in a council house and they have not had hot running water in that house because the boilers have been working for at least 3 months, which is of a great concern, but due to the circumstances of the people in question and the issues they face, they are very unlikely to tell anybody. So it's, and I will raise this independently with outside this, but there's things like that. I'm sure there are a lot of vulnerable people who are in that, but I appreciate what you say. It's very, very difficult, and you know, it's very difficult to be perfect. Thank you.
Just on that specific, that is exactly the sort of person that we'd want to get Community Plus involved with. I've dealt with a similar case in my own ward where I've had an individual who had problems in their council house and they were reluctant to let council staff in to actually do the repairs, and actually usually it's a broader issue around that, you know, not just about that issue about the house. They have other challenges, and it's finding the right person that can get that way in. But yeah, I would definitely share that with Councillor Davis afterwards, and we'll try and pick that up. Does anyone else want to ask any questions, or are we? John?
Thank you. Bit of a nuts and bolts question, really. It's the on the appendix, table 1. I think, and it's just a matter of how we read things in panels, and I think I would have liked to have seen a little bit more separation of what the council has done in response to the cost of living crisis, because some of these are existing items. It does refer to indirect help and support. So I would have, either as a separate table or within that table, I would like to have seen something that's told us about what council is doing and has done recently in direct response to it, just as a clear stated item, you know. The other thing about that table is that we have the item on, I mentioned food banks earlier, so I am gonna sort of bring this up. Local welfare provision support through partners in the form of food banks, and it's got a figure of £164,000 now. Now, I can attest to the help that food banks and new food banks got during the COVID, the ones that were set up during COVID, and that was fantastic. The very, very good support from council. I just wonder how, over what period is that £164,000 and what does it represent? And our local welfare, are these packages from referrals from local welfare? And how does, what does the connection look like between the two?
I'll ask Eamon to come in on that one.
Okay, I'll answer the technical questions on the table. Get the easy ones out of the way. So, yeah, I think it's meant to just be a snapshot of what's been paid out to date in 22-23 at the point that the report was pulled together. So that 164,000, I think, is what's gone out thus far, rather than the totality of what we expect to go out through the years. It's just a snapshot in time, just to give you a flavour of some of the things that are going out there. Probably had a couple of attempts to rearrange the tables, to be honest, because but yeah, noted. We'll see what we can do for going forward in terms of any further similar type presentation. See if we can get it. There's so many different ways to cut it, isn't there? But yeah, we'll take on board your comments about splitting out the council elements.
Paul, Councillor Davis.
Thanks. Yeah, a good question. Just a couple of things, because I think you've answered obviously the technical side. What we try and do as a council is to try and create a situation where we're enabling food banks to become more resilient and sustainable. So it's not always a complete ongoing sum that we're paying all the time. For example, we helped Batley Food Bank some time ago because they had to move premises, so we supported them in rent for a period to help them with that, you know, and they understood it was for a period. So I think quite often that's the approach, but we do have an ongoing relationship with a number of food banks. Just one thing I wanted to pick up though, which I'm sure you're probably aware of anyway, but for other members of the panel, a really exciting project in my view that we're working with at the moment to try and support people with affordable food is with something called the bread and butter thing. And the bread and butter thing is exactly that, is affordable food. It's the ability for people to actually pay a very small amount of money and receive food for that. So I think, and don't hold me to this, but off the top of my head, I think it's something like £7.50, and then I think it's full bags of shopping, which obviously would be a huge amount more than that. We've supported that, run 2 pilots at the moment, one in Kirklees and the other one in Dalton, and that's gone really well. And actually we want to increase that capacity, and we're looking at how we do that going forward. The idea is that becomes sustainable, that it becomes self-funding, that the council provide the seed money and provide that support to get things moving, but actually that the subscription, if you like, it's not a subscription, but that money will keep that sustainable going forward, and that voluntary organisation, the bread and butter thing, will be able to work on that, and that's their model. So a lot of what we're doing is to try and create that sustainability, but also to do it in a way in which we're doing everything to preserve the dignity of citizens as well, that it's not just seen as doling things out to people. So just thought I'd make you aware of that. So that would be part of something that would be reported as an example going forward.
I'm going to bring Councillor Lawson in again.
So, no, thanks for that answer. I mean, that highlights some of the valuable work that council does with third sector, whether it's stop-start, whether it's one-off payments, and what have you. We are obviously going to need to support the third sector going forward, because we cannot do this all by ourselves. And I think those initiatives, those ways of supporting the third sector need to be in view. We need to be able to see what's going on, because otherwise we run risks of duplication and, even worse, gaps. So I think possibly coming back to this panel might be valuable. Thank you.
I absolutely agree, and we're literally in the process of pulling that together as a view of those 2 pilots, but I totally agree with you. I think we need to have that holistic view so that we understand where best we can provide that support. And if we just try and do patchwork fixes, it's not best value, doesn't have the biggest impact as well. So absolutely with you. Yeah, I'm very happy that we could come back to the panel with that.
Thank you for that. I'm looking around to see if there are any more burning questions. I'll probably start to bring things to a close. I'll just summarise a little bit. And I think we have touched on a number of things that I think we're going to cover in the next part of the session, where we start to look forward into what we want to plan to look at during the year, because I think there's been a number of points that we've made, and that last one being an example of it, where probably that's going to influence our thinking in the next section. So we've looked at quite a lot. We've got an offer from Eamon to provide some training on how finance works. Good luck with delivering that, Eamon, because I've been around the finance bit of this. Yeah, I was going to say I've been around the finance bit of this for a number of years, and it's a constantly moving feast.
No, I was just seeing how keen colleagues were when you just reminded him of that. It's honestly, it's a cracking session.
We also will no doubt when we get into our next session talk a little bit about how we want to view the risk register, because we pick that point up. A number of the things that we covered, we looked at we talked about future borrowing concerns, and certainly that will come back as we look at the financial updates through the year. Just for members, if they're not aware, there is also an ad hoc scrutiny panel that is looking at the big regeneration projects in the round. So whilst we would probably have hoped that we would see some of that information through this panel, that's going to be dealt with in a specific, more tightly drawn terms of reference in a scrutiny panel. So we're not seeing that here. It isn't being scrutinised, just so people are aware. We also had a little bit of a discussion about what the potential year-end outcome might be. And yeah, good luck with trying to predict that one. But I think that's another one that we will work through as we go through the year. And I think when we get in the next part of the session where we look at workshop planning, it'll probably become a bit clearer how we may get to that view or have sight of that. There was also questions around competitive salaries. And I know both myself and Councillor Davis were in Personnel Committee yesterday where this was one of the discussions items we were talking about. And I'm sure at some point during the year, we may well be bringing back a look from an HR perspective about the challenge about recruitment. And I'm sure that will feature. There's also good discussion around how we've managed the £150 rebate. We passed our thanks to Sarah and the team for the work that they've done. And it has been, as Councillor Davis said, been quite insightful and enlightening about the challenges that presents, and also how it is helping us in terms of that intelligence, identifying the people that perhaps are more vulnerable and more difficult to contact, to the point that Gary made later on. And, you know, we have picked up about how do we help the people who are most financially vulnerable. And I'm sure that will be a thread through the year as we look at, you know, how we are supporting through what are very challenging times. There was also a question about clarity on what the council has done itself and what perhaps has been done indirectly or through third parties. And again, to be fair to Eamon and the team, I only asked them to pull this presentation together at very short notice. I think I had a couple of days to turn it around or something. So, you know, we will revisit these items again. We also had a little discussion around food banks, and again, probably that's something we'll come back to about that broader welfare provision and how we're supporting people. There was also, and I think it was Eamon that mentioned about the assumptions that we take into our financial planning, and I think this is an area we probably will focus on as well, because if you get the assumptions wrong, your whole predictions are out to scale as well. So I think that will be important, and they were the main points I picked up. So I'd just like to take this opportunity now to thank Sarah and Eamon for coming and attending and providing a bit of an update to us, and to members for contributing, and to Councillor Davis. And just finish with ask if anyone here has any more questions they want to ask in this part of the session. Or we'll close this part of the session and move to the informal session where we'll do some workshop planning. Okay, I think if we just leave it a few minutes and the recording will end. And we'll just have a little comfort break. Okay, thank you.